All right, good morning, y'all. Let's get this party started. Oh, 7 people here. Okay, well, it is what it is. People will trickle in. I've already gotten a few texts from people that said they couldn't make it, but I certainly didn't get 17 texts from people that said they couldn't make it. So hopefully people start trickling in. Hi, you guys there? Hello, can you hear me? Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, ANP. That was a Good Morning Vietnam reference, but again, super old reference. I don't know why. I watch new movies. I just don't get good quotes out of good new movies. New movies suck for good quotes. Weird. Dogs barking outside. Okay, so we need to continue on this whole blood idea and blood flowing in blood vessels idea. So we're going to actually continue using the same notes that we started with yesterday. We don't have much left to do on this, honestly. We are really in a process of, that's why I spend so much time early semester to make sure we're all in the same wavelength, because we're really in a process of reusing information, which is both cool, but if you didn't learn it the first time, you can get behind pretty quick. Does that make sense to everybody? This is why I emphasize certain things so heavily. I hope you guys are over there nodding. For instance, we're going to be talking about intrinsic and extrinsic controls in just a minute. And we're going to be talking about hormones, and we're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system, and we're going to be talking about local chemicals that are going to be released. What makes a target cell a target cell? You know, these sorts of things that are reused over and over and over again are going to be essential to your future medical career, let alone A&P career. I know A&P and future medicine are going to be relatively separate from one another, but you will use this sort of information multiple times over in your career. So we're going to go off of that, and we're going to continue this story about resistance, and we're going to be continuing the story about blood flow. Because yesterday I realized that I kind of led you guys somewhat astray, because when I was talking about diameter, I made sure to emphasize that r to the fourth. What does that tell us? That tells us power, right? R to the fourth power. So which of these variables was the most powerful for controlling resistance? What did we learn yesterday? Which of these variables, length, viscosity, or diameter, is the most powerful? You got it. It's diameter. But then I misled you. Nice, Melissa. Then I misled you, because what did I say is the way that our body controls diameter on a daily basis? What's the only, I kind of misled you by leading you to think that this might be the only way that the human body controls diameter. Exactly, Becca. And I said it's SNS, which is true, but it's not the complete story. That was my fault, because I was kind of in a rush at the end of lecture. I was trying to get it all smashed into a tiny little bit of time. So I want you guys to be adding to this story. It's not the only way that we control the diameter of our blood vessels. So how can we control the diameter? This is the guy that we change the most. Well, first, before we go about changing our diameter, let's clean this equation up a little bit. Because does anybody look at this and just kind of go, crap, 8L, this new symbol, pi, what's going on with all of this? Like, what? Let's just clean it up real quick. Yeah, I mean, it's a cool equation if you learn it, but you don't really need, in normal, healthy people, you don't really need to think about all these different variables. Remember what I went through yesterday? Length. Well, now if we're talking about somebody that's extremely tall or obese, now we start thinking about an increase in the number of blood vessels in the body, and therefore the overall length of blood vessels in the body would go up. Viscosity. In a normal healthy patient, viscosity does not change much. So we're going to try to say these two variables aren't going to change much in an individual patient. We're not changing the length and we're not changing the viscosity rapidly. Therefore, we're going to set those variables as constant. We're just going to say arbitrarily that they don't change much, so let's set them to 1. And then pi is a constant as well. It's 3.14. So do we need to think about pi changing? Is pi ever going to change? No, so we're going to arbitrarily set that to 1. If it's a constant, like length, like viscosity, like pi, we get to ignore it, which I love that about physiology. If it's math, we don't ever get to ignore anything in math. But physiology, we can. So we're going to rewrite this equation. We're going to say resistance is proportional to, well, 8 times length, we're going to set to 1 because it's a constant. Viscosity, we're going to set to 1 because it's a constant. Pi, we're going to set to 1 because it's a constant. And the big one that we change in the body all the time is r to the 4th. So if we take and summarize this equation, what's it come out to be? R is proportional to 1 over little r to the 4th power, where big R is resistance and little r is radius. Does that make sense? So we take the radius of our tube to the 4th power, and as that radius increases, we're really going to simplify this equation. I don't want you guys to forget about length and viscosity, mind you, but for most of my test questions, I will get you guys to focus just on this, where if the radius increases, what's going to happen to the resistance inside of that tube? Increase, decrease, no change. Good. They're inversely proportional, so it does the opposite. Resistance drops. And now if we're talking about blood flow, if resistance drops, what happens to the blood flow, the potential blood flow through that blood vessel? Increase, decrease, no change. Assuming delta P remains constant. And then if the diameter, or radius here, kind of the same idea, decreases, then resistance would increase, decrease, no change, just to be redundant. And if resistance increases, what happens to blood flow? Cool. All right, I'm not going to go through the extra math. There's another way you can simplify this even further, but that tends to confuse students because it has to do with taking delta P divided by 1 over r to the 4th because resistance equals 1 over r to the 4th. So you invert, multiply both sides by r to the 4th. So the final way that we can actually simplify this, we could rewrite this equation one more time mathematically as blood flow is proportional to delta P times r to the 4th. They're the same exact things as saying delta P divided by resistance. Well, if we just take blood flow is proportional to delta P times r to the 4th, do you guys see that if if radius increases, what would happen to blood flow? Before we'd say radius increase, therefore resistance decreases, therefore blood flow increases, but using a new formula, we just say radius increases, therefore blood flow increases. It's the same thing. I like making you guys think about the resistance step, but it's the same thing. Now, let's go back to this idea of diameter, radius, same thing. And let's just say if the body is going to increase the radius of a blood vessel, we call this vaso what? To increase the radius of a blood vessel. We make a blood vessel bigger in diameter. We call it vasodilation. Versus decreasing the radius, what do we call that? That's vasoconstriction. This is where I led you guys astray yesterday, and I apologize about that. There are lots of ways that we can vasodilate and vasoconstrict. There are lots of ways we can vasodilate and vasoconstrict. And we can summarize them as two major categories. One, intrinsic, and two, extrinsic, which we already did intrinsic and extrinsic controls of cardiac output. True story? So what do we know intrinsic means? Inside, from within. And there's another way we can think about inside in the human body, and that's local. So intrinsic controls are local controls. They are happening locally within a tissue. They don't need an outside input. They don't need information coming from the brain or coming from a gland. Extrinsic controls. These aren't local controls, right? These are controls that are coming from somewhere outside of that tissue. And what are the two systems that we can use to communicate over a distance in the human body? You got it. Either the nervous system or the endocrine system. And is vasodilation, vasoconstriction, are those voluntary muscle movement or involuntary muscle movement? And therefore, what part of our nervous system controls it? Autonomic nervous system. And Tariq, I made sure that you guys specifically knew yesterday, so I'm proud of your answer as well. What subdivision of the autonomic nervous system is doing this job? What's the only subdivision of the autonomic nervous system that has receptors on our blood vessels? And the answer is the sympathetic nervous system. So the extrinsic controls are going to be sympathetic nervous system and hormones. And you guys are going to be learning today about some of the hormones that help control our resistance, our vasodilation and our vasoconstriction. Nice simple list to start with, okay? This is what you want to do as you study, is you want to break it down into something that's easier to digest, easier to study, and we're going to build off of it, okay? Sound good? All right, let's learn more about what's going on with blood flow and why we care so much about this formula. If you go through the lecture, you're going to find everything that we just went through, right? What do we know? Blood flow is all about delta P over R, where delta P is the pressure gradient, and the pressure gradient is determined by cardiac output. Capital R is resistance, and we know the number one contributor to resistance is the radius or diameter of that tube. Factors that increase total blood flow. Well, if total blood flow is proportional to the pressure gradient, which is created by cardiac output, divided by resistance, resistance is always opposing blood flow, So if I want to increase total blood flow, I need to increase the pressure gradient and decrease the resistance. Did that make sense? By increase pressure gradient or decrease resistance, both of those would increase our total blood flow. Which one has the most power? Resistance or pressure gradient? Which one can we make very small changes to and have very large changes to total blood flow? I want a few more answers, pretty please, because right now we're a little bit divided. I got some resistances, I got some pressures. Under pressure. No more? No more? Just those 6 people? Resistance. Cool. Just getting you guys to think. All right, cool. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull the plug on this. Okay, yep, you got it. The original da-na-na-na-na-na, and then Ice Ice Baby came and stole that part. Dang you, Vanilla Ice. Another old reference. So let's think about this. The pressure gradient is established by the heart. So cardiac output is required for any pressure gradient created by cardiac output is required for any blood flow. If there is no cardiac output, there's no blood flow. That's pretty darn important, right? Now, assuming that your patient is alive, the heart should be beating. So there will be an established pressure gradient created by that heart. What do we know about resistance is that resistance is proportional to 1 over r to the 4th power. 1 over r to the 4th power. So as we change that radius, we drastically change resistance, don't we? Resistance, the equation for resistance has a power associated with it. The equation for pressure gradient is cardiac output. Cardiac output is proportional or equal to heart rate times stroke volume. No powers in there, is there? So which one of these is more powerful? The pressure gradient or the resistance? Which one can we make small changes to and have drastic control over blood flow? You'll see why I'm saying this in just a second. All right, and the rest of this little portion of the lecture really has to do with velocity. This is pretty simple, is that as the total cross-sectional area increases, which is the blue line, blood flow will also be affected. Blood flow will be decreased. This is just a separate idea, but it's related to blood flow. So I want to always put it in because it's related to the number of blood vessels. So let me just do this real quick. Go back to our little image down here. This is something. No, I think there's a small bug going around the house. My daughter is pretty darn sick, and I don't know. Yeah, it's okay. Thank you. So what I'm going to be talking about is something called cross-sectional area. Cross-sectional area is kind of the same thing as surface area. So this is cross-sectional area, and SA is surface area. They're the same thing. Okay, cross-sectional area is if you take a tube that's running in this direction. Not yet, Melissa. If you take a tube and you think, I will in just a minute, it's just underneath this board. If you take a tube that's running in this direction and you just cut it, right? This is a 3-dimensional tube. And then you look at it from the front, that tube has a certain size to it. It's got a certain area that you just created a cross section for. Does that make sense? and a certain amount of that area is going to be surface. So the surface area of this tube is just the area of the cross-sectional area that is surface. And the blood is only exposed to the inside surface. Yes, no, maybe so? The blood can only interact with the inside surface. That's a surface area. So the idea of increasing cross-sectional area goes as followed. It's the same idea as increasing a surface area. So surface area, what I want you guys to think about is Exhibit A versus Exhibit B, where Exhibit A is a flat line and Exhibit B is a wavy line. Which one of these has a greater surface area, A or B? Which one of these has more surface that's exposed to the world? Seems like that makes sense to everybody. Awesome. Cross-sectional area, which one of these has a greater cross-sectional area? One big tube or thousands upon thousands upon thousands of tiny little tubes? We're looking at all of these little tubes combined. Which one of these would ultimately have a greater cross-sectional area? A or B? Yeah, it's B. It's this second one right here. So oddly enough, as tubes get smaller and smaller and smaller in diameter, the number of those tubes increases exponentially. A big tube in the body is an artery. And arteries, as they're flowing through the body, they start to branch. And as they branch, they get smaller. So arteries turn into what's called arterioles. Those arterioles are smaller than arteries. They're branching and they're going out towards your tissues. You start with this big blood vessel that's leading away from the heart, and then it branches. And as it gets even closer into the tissues, it branches into something called an arteriole. These are very small blood vessels, and there's lots of them. Well, then arterioles are going to branch even more, and they end up feeding into something called a capillary. Capillary beds, really. Capillaries in and of themselves, you guys learned in Unit 1, are crazy tiny. Capillaries are so small that only a single red blood cell can go through at a time. But there are millions, literally millions of capillaries in a very small area of your tissue. That's Exhibit B over here. One big blood vessel ultimately does not have a very high cross-sectional area. Whereas if you took all of these capillaries that are out in your tissues and you did one cross-sectional area of that, it's going to have a massive cross-sectional area, absolutely massive. And we can see that now in this image, is that total cross-sectional area of an elastic artery versus a muscular artery, it's very, very small. I mean, we're nearly down here at 0 centimeters squared. And then look what happens as we get out arterioles. It's branching into smaller blood vessels, and then capillaries. The cross-sectional area just went up exponentially. It's up here at 4,500 centimeters squared of total cross-sectional area. You don't need to necessarily understand what those numbers even mean, but I hope you guys can see that that is an exponential increase. That is huge. Yes, no, maybe so? Cool. Now what I want you guys to think about is a river. I always like to take real life examples. And I take a river that's heading down a mountain, right? And that river is going to get out here near the ocean. And as it heads out towards the ocean, especially down here in Texas, we got this big, huge water supply. Sure, it's got some smaller tributaries entering it. But now as it gets down towards the ocean, it starts to reach level ground. And as it reaches level ground, that river really branches out. Yes, no? These are delta plains. You guys have probably all seen them if you've kind of hung out here in Texas. That river really starts to branch out in these big delta plains. Yes, no, maybe so? So which of these is going to have faster water flow if you're looking at the river? This big ass river or these delta plains? Which one has faster river flowing? Faster water flowing. River flowing, that's funny. The river itself, right? The river itself is one big blood vessel. It's one big source of liquid. And then as that liquid spreads out over a much bigger area and branches and branches and branches, what's going to start happening to the speed that that fluid is going to move? Increase, decrease, no change. So here, fast velocity. Now here is slow velocity. It slows it all down, velocity. Why would we want to slow everything down when it reached the tissues? Why, as that cross-sectional area increases, why would we want to decrease the velocity of the blood going through the capillaries? Great, that's a good idea. Too much for the tissue in terms of too much blood, and we're going to get to what that even means in just a minute. Time for exchange. Becca, I love that. Parker, great, great, great. Both of those answers are good. Melissa, Becca, Parker, all your guys' answers are good. So too much for tissue. If there's too much blood flow into a tissue, what's going to end up happening is the pressure in that area is going to get so great that it can cause, again, edema. You'll keep hearing me say this word, edema. If you don't know what edema is, look it up, EDEMA, but it's fluid in your tissues. But in a normal, healthy patient, we don't really need to worry about edema. So what's going on is we drop that velocity. Remember what we said, a single erythrocyte is passing through this capillary at a time. This is going to give that single erythrocyte more time to release its oxygen and more time to pick up its CO2. This is going to give all the nutrients in the blood more time to get out into those tissues. So time is a very big factor. Cool. All right, let's drop on down here. Why is this all important? A lot of it has to do with pressure. Melissa, a lot of this has to do with pressure, and a lot of this has to do with exchange of materials. Local blood flow or blood flow to a tissue is why we care about blood flow, period. We got to remember that blood is transporting all the goodies, and it's transporting out all the bad things. The ability of blood to reach the tissues that we need it to reach is called perfusion. This is an important word for you guys to learn, please. Perfusion. You must know this word. Perfusion is the delivery of that blood into the capillary beds. So you can see it's defined right here in the bullet point below. Do you think every single tissue in the human body needs the exact same blood flow all the time? Yes or no? No, of course not. And can we change perfusion? That's the delivery of that blood to a tissue. Can we change perfusion through different organs depending on their demand? Yes or no? What do you guys think? Whether or not I've taught it to you or not, I haven't. The answer is yes. Awesome. And that's how the body works. It's all about homeostasis, right? If the tissue needs more blood flow, we can get it more blood flow. If the tissue doesn't need as much blood flow, we get to shut that blood flow off. These are all the different ways that we can do that. Some of this is local. And actually, this isn't on here. I guess this is all local because it says local up above. So this is all intrinsic that is on this particular page right here. These are all intrinsic controls of blood flow. And if you recall, that's where we left off. And Melissa, I think it was Melissa that asked to be able to look at this again. I think that was way up here. Yeah, that was Melissa. Whatever you needed from this, go ahead and grab. Oh no! Of course, no worries. You can go back and watch it. But intrinsic versus extrinsic controls, what we're talking about right now technically would be both controls, but we're being a little bit more specific here on local controls. So, pretty easy. If we have an organ that needs more blood flow, doesn't it stand to reason that that organ will have more blood vessels? Yes, no, maybe so? So we get to simply change the degree of vascularization to that tissue. And I'll show you a slide on that in just a second. Myogenic responses tend to be pretty vague for students to understand. They shouldn't be vague because it's kind of in the word. Myo tells us what? What is myo? Good. Myo's muscle. So this is just a muscular response. It's a smooth muscle response. If local tissue needs more blood flow, then local tissue will alter their blood vessel diameter minutely, very small changes and very rapid changes without any outside information whatsoever. So for instance, if local tissue needs more blood flow, what's it going to try to do to blood vessel diameter? Is it going to vasodilate or is it going to vasoconstrict to increase blood flow? And so just a little bit of stretch, on those blood vessels down at the arterial level, local, just a little bit of stretch. And those local tissues can detect that amount of stretch because they have stretch receptors, baroreceptors, and they're able to respond to that stretch accordingly. So that's what myogenic response means. It just means a local intrinsic ability to change their diameter based on the demands of that tissue. There are also local regulatory factors, and you've been taught, yeah, I'd say taught about a couple of these local regulatory factors that we're going to discuss, and then some of them are going to be other local regulatory factors that will make sense once we start going through them. I have a list of them down here. Don't worry about that. And the last thing that is going to determine local blood flow is the total blood flow. So local blood flow requires the cardiac output to be sufficient to get blood out to that tissue. Does that make sense? Rock on. So let's go through some slides that help explain this. First, degree of vascularization. Different tissues have different vascularization. So what you guys see here is the distribution of cardiac output at rest. And if the number is really big, what does that tell you about the degree of vascularization? Increase, decrease, no change. If there's more cardiac output going to that tissue, what do we know about the degree of vascularization? Yeah, easy peasy lemon squeezy. So look at this list and start telling me where a lot of our blood is going to, and therefore where we have very high levels of vascularization. Oh, digestive for sure. Look at those tiny little kidneys. Look at that, they're tiny. And look at how much blood is going there. Every minute, 20% of your blood goes through your kidneys. That's over a liter of blood that's passing through your kidneys every minute of your life. Digestive system's huge. Sure, it gets 21% of your blood. Awesome. Cool. We need blood. What impresses me the most are these tiny little kidneys. They get more blood than all of your skeletal muscles combined. They get more blood than your brain. That should hopefully impress y'all. That's pretty cool, I think. And it's going to be really relevant to their function. Now, that being said, the tissue that is the most sensitive to blood is your brain. All the rest of these organs have the ability to regulate themselves if they need to. They can actually go through stages of hypoxia and hypoglycemia, and they'll survive. The brain, on the other hand, is crazy, crazy sensitive to perfusion. If perfusion stops to the brain for more than 15 seconds, that brain is going to shut itself off to protect it, to try to conserve its energy sources. This is called passing out, right? If you lose oxygen for more than 15 seconds, complete total lack of oxygen flowing to the brain. I'm not talking about holding your breath. I'm talking about cutting blood flow off to the brain. Does that make sense? If that occurs for more than 15 seconds, the most likely scenario is your brain will shut itself off and you will pass out. This is the sleeper hold. You guys know what I'm talking about, I'm sure, especially in today's day and age. That's the one you see in movies where they put that arm around that person's neck and then they slowly fall asleep, right? They pass out. They never show the full 15 seconds in movies. But anyways, the brain is very sensitive to adequate perfusion. We must make sure that blood flow to the brain is adequate. So at all other costs, we can shut down blood flow to most of these other tissues to make sure that the brain gets enough blood flow. So if we vasoconstricted all of the blood vessels to the digestive system, that's 21% extra blood that can go to the rest of your organs. True story? Does that make sense? Pretty powerful. That's a lot of blood. And if you're running from Mr. Axeman, where do we want that extra blood to go to? Do we want it to go to our liver? No, we don't need it to go to our liver during that time. To our kidneys? No, we don't want to be peeing while we're running from Mr. Axeman. A little bit goes to our skin for sweating and stuff, but we need it to go to our brain, our heart muscle, and our skeletal muscle. So these blood vessels down here are going to vasodilate, and the rest of these blood vessels are going to vasoconstrict. Does that make sense? So what type of adrenergic receptors will be found in the digestive system, the liver, parts of your kidneys, your skin? Which adrenergic receptor is excitatory and will cause vasoconstriction? Good job, Heather. That's the alpha-1 adrenergic receptor. So these organs all are going to have that alpha-1 adrenergic receptor. What about the heart muscle and the skeletal muscle blood vessels? What about the blood vessels to the heart and the blood vessels to skeletal muscle? What type of adrenergic receptors do we find there? Good, Ashley. Great job. So I hope most people are remembering this, even if they didn't remember it immediately. These are beta-2 adrenergic receptors. And those, with the 2, those are going to dilate. So vasodilation, that's how we control where blood flow goes at any given time. This is how the body can start to regulate it. Now, I know that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about local controls, but I always want to show this because students have the hardest time understanding those dang adrenergic receptors. So I'm always, always, always throwing them into my lectures so you guys can get it. Get it. So just to go back to our list here, the heart doesn't vasodilate, Trisha. I had somebody else that texted me that. Just to make sure you understand, it's not the heart muscle that has beta 2, it's the blood vessels to the heart. And then what else do we want working really well when you're running from Mr. Axeman? What other tissues of the body do we want working well if you got an elephant chasing you? Lungs, for sure, you're not wrong. There are beta 2 adrenergic receptors on your lungs, but that's not where we're at right now. We're running, hint, hint, running from Mr. Axeman. So your skeletal muscles also need lots of blood. Does that make sense, Trisha? So I'm just trying to make sure to work in the logic, not just tell you guys the answer, but also help you guys think through it on your own so that later it makes sense. All right, so myogenic responses I don't have a separate slide for, but these are just local muscle controls. These are just local muscle changes. In all of these cases, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic controls, what ends up happening is it's the arterioles that are going to vasoconstrict and they're going to vasodilate. So even with local blood flow or with extrinsic controls, all of them end up talking to the arterioles. And the reason why is because arterioles have smooth muscle that surround them. And that smooth muscle is contractile, right? Therefore, it's the smooth muscle that's going to end up changing the diameter of our blood vessels. Can't change the diameter of our blood vessels if there's no smooth muscle. So what do you notice about the capillaries? Besides these little sphincters here, do you guys see any smooth muscle out here in the capillary bed? Yes, no? No, 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 definitely not. So we're not vasoconstricting and vasodilating our capillaries. That's not very possible. What about the venule? This is a little vein leading back to bigger veins. You see a little bit of smooth muscle, but how much smooth muscle is there in the venule relative to the arteriole? More or less in the venule? Less. So what is going to be our strongest control of blood flow? Arterioles, capillaries, or venules? Definitely arterioles. Definitely arterioles. Again, because smooth muscle. I'm trying to give you guys landmarks that will help you through the rest of the semester. If we have vasodilation and vasoconstriction, what do you know about those blood vessels? They have smooth muscle. Does that make sense to everybody? You cannot vasodilate and vasoconstrict if there's not smooth muscle. You must have smooth muscle. We're going to learn more about meta-arterioles. This thing right here is called a meta-arteriole. And there's a through-fare channel that goes right through the middle of a capillary bed. And there are capillary sphincters. It doesn't flow. Yes is the answer. Blood flow will be lower in venules and veins. But that's just because, one, pressure is dropping, and two, yeah, they don't really change their diameter a whole heck of a lot. We'll come back to that. Let's deal with that. Let's deal with that later because that has to do with blood pressures and stuff. But yeah, you're not wrong. It definitely flows much slower through venous return. Anyways, precapillary sphincters. All I want you guys to do with this particular slide, and we'll get to the microcirculation at another lecture, is look at these sphincters. These are circular muscle groups that surround the blood vessels leaving the meta-arteriole. Don't overthink this. This precapillary sphincter, if it is relaxed, can blood pass through this blood vessel, yes or no? Yeah, sure. It's relaxed. And therefore, blood gets to go out into the capillary bed. So as long as these precapillary sphincters are relaxed, then blood goes to that tissue. But what if I were to constrict these precapillary sphincters? What's going to happen to blood flowing out into the capillary bed? Increase, decrease, no change. So in other words, we shunt off the blood. We're going to close off blood going out to those tissues. So even if blood passes through that organ or through that tissue, it's not going to end up getting filtered here. It's not going to drop off its nutrients. It's going to pass right back into the venule system, go back to the inferior and superior vena cava, go back to the heart, and the heart beats again and sends it to where it needs to go. Does that make sense? So all of these things help control blood flow. There are some other things that influence blood flow, like metabolic activity or tissue damage. You guys learned that if we have tissue damage and we're going to go clot, what was the first phase of coagulation? What's the first phase of blood clotting, of hemostasis? It was vascular spasm. Yeah, it's vasoconstriction. So when tissue damage happens, those local blood vessels vasoconstrict. Good. You're going to see that that has to do with specific factors that you've learned before, and then a few factors that you haven't learned about before. But I'm just going to throw them out there, and then I'll focus you guys on what you have learned before, because that's the style of teaching I like, is I like to teach about redundancies. Listen, this list looks long, but it's not complicated because there's a lot of logic that goes through this. O2. The amount of oxygen going to your tissue is going to help to determine how much blood flow is going to that tissue. Because if oxygen levels get too low, what's the body going to want to do to the oxygen levels in that tissue? Increase, decrease, no change. So what's the body going to want to do to blood flow to that tissue to get it more oxygen? Increase, decrease, no change. I only have a couple people answering. These are metabolic changes, local changes to chemical levels within your tissue. These are intrinsic local controls, y'all. So if an organ, like your skin, starts getting too little oxygen, what's the body going to try to do to the amount of oxygen going to that organ? Increase, decrease, no change. Sometimes it just takes a second and rephrase the question. Did that make more sense to everybody? It's just got we got homeostasis. Oxygen levels dropped. Let's get more oxygen to that tissue. So what do we want to do? Vasoconstrict or vasodilate? Good. And then one more round. What's that going to do to blood flow? Increase, decrease, no change blood flow to that organ. Good. Good. Did that make more sense to everybody? You guys were probably just overwhelmed by this list and reading stuff on the slide, and I don't like it when you guys read stuff on slides. That's why I do so much chalk talk. That's the logic I want you guys thinking about here. If nutrient levels, what if glucose gets too low to an organ? What's the body going to try to do blood flow to that organ? Increase, decrease, no change to get more glucose to that organ. What if carbon dioxide starts to build up in an organ? Is CO2 good or is CO2 bad? Oh yeah, it's bad. So what are we going to want to do to blood flow to get that CO2 out of that tissue faster? You got it. right? Let's increase blood flow so blood flows faster and gets that CO2 out of there. Does that make sense? What about hydrogens? Is acid good? Do we want hydrogens building up in our tissues? Hell no. So if acid starts building up in your tissues, let's increase blood flow. Get rid of it. Is hyperkalemia good? No. That starts to alter the resting membrane potentials of your tissues. So if potassium starts to build up, let's increase blood flow and let's get rid of it. Lactic acid. We don't want lactate building up in our tissues. Let's increase blood flow and get rid of it. Adenosine, prostaglandins, these are metabolic waste potential. Let's get rid of them. Does that make sense? It's all about homeostasis. You don't have to overthink these. You don't have to overthink these, I promise. What about tissue damage? If you get tissue damage versus cell damage versus an immune response versus an inflammatory response, we need different controls of those arterioles at the local level. Histamine. Anybody ever had an allergic reaction? Did I do my I don't know, did I look up allergic reactions online for you guys? No, I didn't think so. Who loves Will Smith? I know I do. I love this, right? What ends up happening to poor Will Smith over here? He eats some shellfish and his face blows up like a balloon. Just an absolute veritable balloon here, right? Happens in lots of movies. Food allergies, they occur. There are lots of food allergies out there. I do love Fresh Prince. Will Smith, man, he was a big influence on my childhood. So what do people take when they start having an allergic reaction? What do they go to the store, CVS, whatever, Walgreens, HEB? What are you picking up at the pharmacy? Typically, if you're having an anaphylactic shock or an inflammatory response, what do we take? We take antihistamines. Why do we take antihistamines? Because what's causing the inflammatory response are histamines. Does that make sense? Histamines cause an inflammatory reflex. So what's going to happen to blood flow is histamine causes an increase in blood flow to that tissue, and that increased blood flow to that tissue is what causes the inflammation and the edema and the swelling. If I'm going to increase blood flow to an area, this is a vasodilator. Yes, no, maybe so? It's a very powerful vasodilator too. Bradykinin, you guys can look this guy up. I won't test you on it. Nitric oxide, I will test you guys on because you guys have learned it before. Nitric oxide is constantly being secreted by local healthy blood vessels, the endothelial layer of the blood vessels. And nitric oxide is constantly allowing for vasodilation. We talked about nitric oxide earlier this semester. We talked about nitric oxide synthase earlier this semester. It's all happening so fast, I'm sure you might have forgotten. But synthase, S-Y-N-T-H-A-S-E, means that it's an enzyme that breaks down nitric oxide. Nitric oxide synthase would be NOS. We got no and we got nos. It's actually NO, we go nitric oxide, and this is called NOS. NOS is typically referred to as NOS. So nitric oxide synthase breaks nitric oxide down. So what if we blocked nitric oxide synthase? What would happen to the amount of nitric oxide in the system if we stop it from being broken down? If we inhibit the synthase, We're not breaking nitric oxide down, therefore nitric oxide levels would increase. And what would happen to vasodilation? Increase, decrease, no change. Yeah, it would increase. And therefore, what would happen to blood flow? Increase, decrease, no change. So we started using these nitric oxide synthase inhibitors a while back. Pharmaceutical companies were pretty stoked about identifying nitric oxide synthase as a potent vasodilator, and they wanted to use it in patients with hypertension and heart issues, trying to increase blood flow in these patients. But there was a little side effect that somebody else decided to make billions of dollars on. So what is a nitric oxide synthase inhibitor? And this will help you think about what nitric oxide does. What little blue pill is a nitric oxide synthase inhibitor? It's Viagra. So if I block the breakdown of nitric oxide, it vasodilates and causes an increase in blood flow. Well, that's great if it's just restricted to the heart, but it's not just restricted to the heart. So Viagra has a side effect of, if it lasts more than 2 hours, you should consult with a doctor. Is that helpful for you guys to understand nitric oxide function a little bit better? Because that's all I'm after. Cool. Vasoconstrictors, endothelins, prostaglandins, and then the one you guys have seen before is thromboxane A2. So thromboxanes are potent vasoconstrictors at the local level. So please, please, please know at least thromboxane. Endothelins and prostaglandins are also important. Physical factors, myogenic response, stretch, stretch, and more stretch. If your blood vessels start to stretch, they're going to respond to protect themselves. Last but not least, oddly enough, one of the most therapeutic or medically relevant things on this page, heat and cold. Heat, your body responds to heat. When you go outside and it's 100 degrees outside, what does your body do? Sweat, right? Sweat, wet. Got to go in like a turbo vet. What? Another old reference. What can I do? Can't stop myself. I should stop myself. I just don't. Cold. If you go outside and you're super duper cold, like during the freeze, you're not sweating. Instead, you start to shut down and shiver. So heat, right? You go outside in a hot weather, your body's trying to release heat. Does that make sense? Whereas if you're cold, your body tries to retain that heat and make its own heat too. So vasculature is going to respond accordingly. If I want to release heat, do I want to vasodilate to get more blood out to the surface of your skin so that that hot blood can be exposed to the outside world? The answer is yes. So during a hot response, you vasodilate. More blood flow, more sweating, trying to get that blood to the surface of your skin. Versus if somebody's super cold, you know how their skin starts to turn pale and white, and you can actually start to see blue lips if they get too cold. Versus if they get hot, it starts turning red, right? So as you get cold, it vasoconstricts. So heat vasodilate, cold vasoconstricts. So what if we need to get more blood flow to a tissue to help it heal? What are we going to use? Hot pack or a cold pack? But what if we want to shut down blood flow to a damaged tissue because we don't want to cause inflammation? So now you guys understand hot packs and cold packs a little bit better. Most of the time you're going to want to alternate these, or at least do cold pack, let it get back to room temperature, cold pack, let it get back to room temperature. You don't want to just shut down blood flow to a tissue. You want to make sure that you alternate. Unless it's post-surgery, then you just put cold on there and say, deal with it. All right, you guys feel somewhat comfortable with these lists of intrinsic controls? You will be tested on some of them, but the ones that I focused you on. Cool. Now, extrinsic controls. We already have our list here of extrinsic controls. It's sympathetic nervous system and hormones. Sympathetic nervous system and hormones. We got a neural control and we got a hormonal control. Sympathetic activity controls arterioles because only adrenergic receptors are found on arterioles. Yeah, exactly. What makes a target cell a target cell? Receptors. Why does the parasympathetic nervous system not directly affect this? Because there's no muscarinic receptors. I could say this 1,000 times over, and unfortunately, it's still hard to learn. So you have to force that issue, okay? You have to learn that and think that way. Now, it's the vasomotor center found within the CVCC. You guys remember learning about the cardiovascular control center? And we focused on the cardioacceleratory and cardioinhibitory functions of the CVCC earlier, last week. But now we're talking about the vasomotor center. So CVCC is cardiovascular control center, and there was both a cardio center and a vascular center. Yes, no? So all of that neural control is controlled by that vasomotor center. There's no other part of the brain that's going to control it. Only your medulla oblongata, portions of your reticular formation, if you learn about reticular formation in A&P1. Now, sympathetic nervous system is neural. What neurotransmitter is released with sympathetic activity? I knew I tricked somebody. I don't want to trick you guys. What neurotransmitter? I didn't say transmitters. I said transmitter. I need you guys to remember that norepinephrine and epinephrine are two different things. Norepinephrine is the only neurotransmitter. It's the only one that's released at a synapse. Norepinephrine also doubles as a neurohormone. If norepinephrine is released from the adrenal medulla, then it goes into the bloodstream. It wouldn't normally go into the bloodstream, would it? It only occurs in a emergency situation. But if norepinephrine's in your bloodstream, that means it's a hormone, and it was released from the adrenal medulla, not at a synapse. Does that make sense to everybody? Trying to get that through to y'all. So as a neural control goes, vasomotor center, sympathetic activity, this is only norepinephrine. And norepinephrine binds to alpha-1 adrenergic receptor. Make sense? And if it binds to alpha-1 adrenergic receptor, is this going to cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation? Always vasoconstriction on that one. Now, in an emergency response, norepinephrine and epinephrine are both going to get dumped into the system. Norepinephrine binds to the alpha-1 adrenergic receptors through the body, but the brain luckily lacks alpha-1 adrenergic receptors because we need to make sure we do not have vasoconstriction to the brain. Does that make sense? Cannot have alpha-1 adrenergic receptors to the brain because in an emergency response, it would shut blood supply off to the brain. Yes, no, maybe so? I could teach you guys one more thing, actually, real quick. Yeah, that'd be no bueno for sure. Just real quick here, won't take long. Won't take long. The three major adrenergic receptors you all have to learn this semester and focus on this semester are alpha 1, beta 1, and beta 2. Okay, where alpha 1 is excitatory, beta 1 is excitatory, beta 2 is inhibitory. Vasoconstriction, beta 1's found on cardiac tissue, not blood vessels. Beta 2, vasodilation. So alpha 1 is going to be found on places that during an emergency response we want to vasoconstrict. Beta 2 is going to be found in locations where during an emergency response we want it to vasodilate. Does that make sense? So with tissues, we want to increase blood flow and decrease blood flow. So decrease blood flow, alpha 1, increase blood flow, beta 2. Sweet. Awesome. Okay. So kind of have that taken care of. Did that make sense to everybody? Beta 1 isn't going to really have it's not going to have an indirect effect on blood. Gosh, this is a good place to do this. We'll come back to beta 1 and what its effect will be on blood flow. It's a tricky one. It's a very tricky one. We'll come back to that in just a second. So what I'm going to talk to you guys about is affinity. So the affinities of norepinephrine versus epinephrine. Each one of these has a different affinity for those neurotransmitter neurohormones. Remember what affinity was? It's the ability to bind to that receptor. Do you guys remember that word? I tried to teach it to you earlier this semester, the ability to bind. So norepinephrine, for instance, loves alpha 1. Norepinephrine seeks out alpha 1s. It just loves it. Now, does that mean epinephrine cannot activate alpha 1? Sure, it can. But alpha 1 adrenergic receptors have a greater affinity for norepinephrine relative to epinephrine. It prefers norepinephrine. If norepinephrine's in the system, it will bind to a stronger degree to alpha 1s. Beta 1, another honey badger reference. Beta 1 don't care. Whatever's in the system will bind to beta 1. Beta 1 just wants to get that heart going better. So norepinephrine binds to the exact same affinity as epinephrine. Whatever's in the system is going to bind to beta 1. It don't care. Beta 2, you guys starting to see what's happening here? What's going to happen with beta 2? What does beta 2 prefer? What's going to bind to a greater affinity to beta 2? So now norepinephrine is less than epinephrine. It prefers epinephrine. Definitely not acetylcholine. That was just, you overthought the heck out of that, Heather. No worries at all. We all do it. Acetylcholine has nothing to do with the adrenergic system. So don't get yourself tricked up by overthinking. Okay? Just working with norepinephrine versus epinephrine here. And epinephrine prefers beta 2. In fact, beta 2 is found places that do not have an innervation. So if we had a vasomotor center up in the brain, remember, innervation just means that there's an axon that leads down to a tissue and it innervates that tissue. So now it's going to have synaptic boutons. And down here at these synaptic boutons, there are always on the target organ going to be alpha 1 adrenergic. Does that make sense? Always. No ifs and or buts. The target organ always has these, alpha 1 adrenergic, if it's innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. Yes, no, maybe so? Because norepinephrine. Beta 2 are going to be found on tissues, like here we'll draw a blood vessel that does not have or has very little direct innervation. So here's a blood vessel There's no axon going off to that blood vessel. Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have alpha 1s there. Like on your heart, the coronary arteries of your heart, they don't have a bunch of innervation of the nervous system. So they're primarily going to have beta 2 adrenergic. There's no innervation to most beta 2 adrenergic receptors. You see now, epinephrine's going to have a greater effect on this because epinephrine's inside that bloodstream. Norepinephrine is the only neurotransmitter in the body, so it's being released here, acting on alpha 1. Yes, no, maybe so? The body's smart. It's designed to help you. Sometimes it'll kill you. It's so helpful that it'll kill you. Norepinephrine, alpha 1, vasoconstriction. Epinephrine, beta 2, vasodilation. Where do we find beta 2? Arterial smooth muscles, blood vessels, coronary arteries, skeletal muscle blood vessels. Where do we find adrenergic alpha 1s? Pretty much everywhere else. Digestive system, kidney, skin, bones, not the brain. Okay, we good? You know I'll test you on that stuff. I've emphasized it so strongly at this point. You will be tested on norepinephrine versus epinephrine. And I'm going to do it in a way that hopefully doesn't trick you up. I'm going to send you home because it's 10:12 here. So let me give you guys a problem to think about. Text me when you think about this and come up with your answer. Blood flow is proportional to delta P over resistance. I don't know why I didn't switch to here. Blood flow is proportional to delta P over resistance. This is just a take-home critical thinking question, okay? Text me when you think of an answer. Not immediately because we're still in class. I want you to think about two different organs. One, I want you to think about the digestive system. And two, I want you to think about skeletal muscles. Now the question goes as follows. If you're running from Mr. Axeman, yeah, you should see the chalk talk. Is that, what's going on? Is it visible to everybody else? Oh, bummer. So Heather, you can't see it, froze on the slide. So go ahead and refresh your side. So the question goes as follows. You're running from Mr. Axeman. What's going to happen to blood flow and how? What's going to happen to blood flow to the digestive system? What's going to happen to blood flow to skeletal muscles? So if you're running from Mr. Axeman, what happens to blood flow? Keep in mind that you need to think about what's happening to both delta P and resistance. Don't just think about one of those variables. Both of those variables are going to be affected by the sympathetic nervous system. Go ahead and take a screenshot of this, or if you're writing it down. That wasn't a very well-worded question. Running from Mr. Axeman, what happens to blood flow? Question mark. Think about what happens to both delta P and resistance in your answer. Everybody understand that they should text me when they come up with an answer to this? It's going to be a lot bigger of an answer than you think at first glance. It's going to be a lot bigger, a lot more complicated than you think at first glance. Okay, the human body is always more complicated than first glance. Now, there are a few other hormones you guys need to learn about here. In fact, it's not just ADH. There are other guys here you guys need to know about. What about aldosterone? That one works too. ADH and aldosterone from Unit 1. ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Aldosterone, which is going to be a mineral corticoid. Do you guys remember these two hormones and me saying, you must learn them, you must learn them, you must learn them? You may remember that, you may not remember that, I don't know. But you must know about these hormones. Aldosterone is released from the adrenal cortex. EDH is released from the posterior pituitary. And both of these hormones are very powerful vasoconstrictors. And we're going to be talking about them more tomorrow. A lot more than you want to. You're going to have to know every little tiny little bit of detail about ADH and aldosterone by the end of the semester. But we're just going to be doing it chunks at a time. ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Do we pee more or do we pee less? Oh, we pee less. And if we pee less, what's going to happen to our blood volume? If the urine volume drops, we're peeing less, what happens to blood volume? And therefore, what would happen to blood pressure? If blood volume's going up, there's more blood in your blood vessels and blood pressure's going up. Awesome. Well, check it out. ADH also is a potent vasoconstrictor. And if I start to vasoconstrict my blood vessels, what's going to start happening to blood pressure? As I make the diameter of those tubes smaller and smaller and smaller. I know we're talking about blood flow here, but I'm just trying to create a link for you guys. Yeah, blood pressure starts to go up. So do you guys see that the purpose of ADH and aldosterone, whether it's going to cause vasoconstriction, whether it's going to cause water retention or sodium retention, and then the water follows it, all of those are all about increasing blood availability, blood pressure, and blood flow. We want to make sure more blood is doing what it needs to do with ADH and aldosterone. We'll come back to that. Ang2, angiotensin 2, right now, all I want you guys to do is transcribe this word, angiotensin 2, and we abbreviate that capital ANG 2, Roman numeral 2, not the number 2, whatever. If you do the number 2, that's fine. I don't really care. Cranial nerves, you have to put Roman numerals. You guys know that probably by now. Ang2, you will be learning in a lot more detail tomorrow. This guy right here is, I wanted to say probably, but I'm going to tell you, it is the most powerful hormone in the human body on your blood pressure. Blood vessel tension, you got it. It's going to cause massive blood pressure stuff. Ang2 is extremely powerful in impacting your blood pressure. So what would start happening? Potent vasoconstriction. This is just the very start of what you guys need to learn about Ang2 by tomorrow, not today, but I want you to start thinking about it right now. What would start to happen if we had too much Ang2 in the system? If Ang2 levels started to increase, what's going to be happening to vasoconstriction? Increase, decrease, no change? Yeah. This is going to cause massively high BP. So normally in the body, when Ang2 is produced, we have a way to break Ang2 down really fast. It gets broken down into Ang3, and then it no longer acts like Ang2. What would happen if we stopped the breakdown of Ang2? Ang2 levels would start to go up. Does that make sense? This is one of the major functions of COVID. COVID blocks the enzyme, the receptors that actually make the enzymes that break down Ang2, causing Ang2 levels to go up rapidly in your patients. This is what causes all the downstream later in life problems. Even if somebody is relatively asymptomatic, they can start to have blood pressure and heart failure issues later. It's already been confirmed. We'll come back and talk more about Ang2. It's crazy powerful. Now, this list over here is a little bit more comprehensive. I do love this table. I'm not normally a big fan of tables, but this is a really well organized table. Vasodilators, vasoconstrictors, intrinsic versus extrinsic. Pretty cool, huh? I love this table. You guys need to know everything that's on this table. There are those intrinsic vasodilators we talked about. We focused on, if oxygen levels start to drop, we're going to increase blood flow. If nutrient levels start to block, we're going to drop, we're going to increase blood flow, or if anything starts to happen here. These are all bad. Carbon dioxide, acid, potassium, lactate, these are all bad. So we're going to want to get rid of those so we increase blood flow. Histamine, increasing inflammation. Bradykinin, we didn't really discuss. It's cool though, but I don't have time. Nitric oxide, we did discuss. So these are all vasodilators. And then vasoconstrictors, opposite effects. And then, of course, these local cytokines. Now, over here, epinephrine's the only vasodilator that we've talked about. And then there's your list of your other things. Aldosterone, ADH, norepinephrine, these are all vasoconstrictors. So if you notice, there's one hormone on this list that we have not discussed yet. It's called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. Peptide tells you it's a protein. The first word tells you what's producing it. So what organ in the body, is producing ANP? Help me help you so we can get out of here. What organ of the body is producing ANP? The heart. The heart. The heart has endocrine function. The heart has endocrine function. The heart produces a hormone. Let's look at what this hormone does using its name. Natria. I know not everybody knows the Latin stuff, but what element have you guys written down 1,000 times that is Na? Sodium. Sodium is Na because in Latin, sodium is natria. So natriuretic. What about urea? Uretic. What does that tell us? What's going to be happening? Uretic. To excrete urine, right? This is excretion of urine. Does that make sense? So let's look at the whole word now so we understand its function a little bit better. This is produced by the heart, more specifically by the atria. And what it's going to cause the patient to do is pee more salt. They're going to be peeing more sodium. And what do we know about osmosis? I'm going to teach you guys a real quick, easy way to deal with osmosis. So osmosis is pretty simple. You guys learned about how there's a cell. Oh, goodness. Focus. There we go. That cells in the body, you guys remember doing this last semester? There was some sort of solution inside of the cell. There's a solution outside of the cell. And then you guys actually did an experiment where water started moving around, and it confuses like 90% of students if they're not taught correctly about tonicity. You guys know what I'm talking about? How many people were confused by tonicity in A&P1? I'm thinking most students end up getting pretty confused by tonicity in A&P1, but it's not that confusing. Okay, all it has to do with is particles and where water likes to be. Now, osmosis is just the diffusion of water. That's literally its definition, right? Diffusion of water. Diffusion is passive energy. So everything in the universe is trying to go from an area of, everything's trying to go from high to low, even water. Water's part of the universe, so it's trying to go from high to low. Diffusion of water has a specific name called osmosis. So if I have a glass, and that glass has water in it, and I had another glass, and that glass has salt water in it, okay, there's salt floating around inside that water. Which one of these has more water? A or B? And therefore, water wants to go from high to low. So if I put a semi-permeable membrane between these, water wants to go from high water to low water. Do you guys see how water is going towards that salt? Yes, no, maybe so? In other words, the body is filled with particles. Particles are pretty much anything that attracts water. Particles are sodium, particles are potassium, particles are albumin. Okay, a particle is just a chemical. Particles. Well, particles, there's a cool word right in here. P-A-R-T-I. Well, shit, let's just change that to party. Dude, water loves to party. Water always, always, always must 100% influenced by the party. Water will always go to the party. So from here on out, y'all, if I ask you, where does water want to be? The answer is party. Where does water want to be? It wants to be where the party's at. It always wants to be where the party's at. End of story. There's no if and or buts. There's no, but Dr. H, it could. No. Water wants to be where the party is at. End of story. The answer is party. Right? This is the woot woot. This is the woot woot. Water is always yelling out woot woot. So tonicity is not that hard to understand because the inside of the cell has a number. We'll deal with that later. What if the outside of the cell has a bigger number? Where's the party at? Wherever the number's bigger. So where does water want to be? Water leaves that cell. Now, what if the outside of the cell has a smaller number? Well, then the party's inside the cell. Where does water want to be? It wants to be where the party's at. So now let's think about if we pee out sodium, oh no, we're peeing out our party. So where does water want to be? Water goes with that sodium. So what's going to happen to that patient as they pee out that sodium is they start to lose water. Yeah, you're peeing out that party. Later, party. I'll eat more popcorn later and get you back. Party! So now when we go back here and we look at A&P, and if we're peeing out sodium, we're peeing out our blood, right? So what's going to happen to that patient's blood pressure as they're peeing out all that sodium? Increase, decrease, no change. If you pee out sodium, water follows. So the urine volume increases and the blood volume decreases. Vasodilation also helps us drop our blood pressure, increasing blood flow to certain areas of the body. The blood pressure is going to start to drop. So now you can start seeing correlations. And we're going to be going into the next lecture tomorrow, you're going to be learning about all of these different controls for blood pressure. And you're going to find that it's not that complicated, even though it looks insanely complicated. It's not that complicated because it's all about altering resistances, altering cardiac output, and altering your blood and urine volumes. And if you keep that in mind, blood pressure is actually much more simplified, much less complicated, still complicated, but not as complicated. All right, and with that, love you guys. Stay on task, stay on target, continue learning. Where does water want to be, y'all? You're going to use this for the rest of the semester. In fact, I have students that will text me. I've had students that texted me that took me 8 years ago that will just, text me about a random patient that they had, and it made them think about the parte. And it's, I don't know. One day I was teaching and I was like, party sounds like, particle. And it was, it's funny. It just all kind of, and I started teaching doing that, and students never misunderstood osmosis again. So it's a really easy way to understand osmosis. Hi again and bye. Yeah, stay on target, y'all. And best of luck. Text me if you have questions. And I'll see you tomorrow. We'll talk about blood pressure.